Joining us now is Brad Polumbo, the Deputy Opinion Contributors Editor at the Washington Examiner. Brad, last time we were talking about how entertaining the last debate was, and I think that this one last night kind of took a totally different turn. It was a lot of yelling over each other. The questions just weren't there for me. What is your response to last night's debate?
Well, it was definitely a lot less fun than the previous debate, and it was also, I have to say, it was poorly moderated. I mean, you mentioned this in your intro, but there were candidates shouting over each other. There were just people interjecting, and it really turned into kind of a free-for-all at several points last night, and it wasn't really, I don't think, elucidating or illuminating for voters to hear them bickering at each other like that. And I don't think it was a very productive debate, and I think CBS actually botched it, to be honest.
No, I agree. And questions towards the end kill me. The ones that it's like, what is your biggest flaw? What's your motto? Things like that. I get nothing out of that, you know? I mean, it just is
They're wasting our time.
Absolutely. And there's, 7 candidates on the stage already. You need to make the differences between them, and hearing them kind of give themselves backhanded compliments isn't what does that job. And I think when that happens, when, to your point, when everybody's yelling over each other, it kind of just helps the front runner because nobody else really gets their moment. Is there anyone that you think had a big night?
No, I think some candidates, Mike Bloomberg didn't have as bad a night as last time. He had somewhat of a better response for Elizabeth Warren bringing up charges of sexism against him. So Mike Bloomberg wasn't as bad as last time. And then Joe Biden didn't talk that much, but when he did talk, didn't say anything ridiculous. Other than, I will say, the one point where he said that of 150 million people, half the U.S. population have been killed by guns. Uncle Joe, that's not quite right. So he made a big error there, but most of the debate he did fine, which I guess helps him going into South Carolina because he didn't do anything that will mess it up horribly. But I think that you're right. All the chaos really just helps Bernie Sanders preserve the status quo, and that status quo is that we have a septuagenarian socialist as the Democratic Party's frontrunner.
And, you know, that comes as bad news for a lot in the Democratic establishment as well. I mean, if you turn on MSNBC after the debates, it's pretty upfront about that. They're scared about the prospect of a Bernie Sanders nomination. So I guess the question now becomes for a lot of these moderates is that they have to make their move soon. I mean, South Carolina is this weekend, and Super Tuesday is March 3rd. And it looks right now that Bernie Sanders might be the only one to take delegates coming out of California. I mean, there's some other people that 15% threshold, but he could run away with this nomination if nothing is done, if the moderates don't kind of come around one candidate. Do you see any moves coming before Super Tuesday?
Look, I don't really see anything coming, and I think it's going to end up being a repeat of the 2016 Republican primary. If you remember, you originally had a field of 16 candidates, and between Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, John Kasich, and all the others, they failed to coalesce around one Trump alternative, which allowed Trump to build a runaway lead in the delegates, even though he only had 35 to 40% of the vote. Well, you're seeing the same exact thing here happen with Bernie Sanders. You know, it is possible that if Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Mike Bloomberg, all their voters coalesced around one candidate before Super Tuesday, then they could take this nomination and the lead away from Bernie Sanders. But it doesn't look like any of them are willing to do that. And the result there is that it's really becoming increasingly hard to see how Sanders doesn't end up with this nomination.
No, I think you're absolutely right, because it's kind of an interesting thing where the Democratic Party talks about how united it is against President Trump, but then they can't necessarily unite against one candidate, even when they see the party kind of losing grasp of what they've known for in the past. They see Bernie Sanders threatening the establishment that they've had for so long, the norms that they've had, and they don't see that he's necessarily the best candidate to beat President Trump. Now, there are other polls that suggest otherwise, but this is looking like the only possible outcome for them is kind of a brokered convention. Is that why Mike Bloomberg is kind of still in the race, still kind of putting out ads and polls in later states, such as Super Tuesday?
Well, yeah, for some of these candidates like Bloomberg and Elizabeth Warren, it really seems that their only path to the nomination is through a brokered convention where if Bernie Sanders doesn't get the number of delegates required to just get the nomination outright, then there's a lot of, party mechanics and behind-the-scenes rules that come into place. So what I think they're going for, especially Bloomberg, is to get enough delegates that it's close, right? Because if you have a situation where Bernie Sanders doesn't get enough to get the nomination all out, but he has way more than anyone else, yet the DNC gives the nomination to Elizabeth Warren, you'll have absolute electoral disaster. You'll have the Bernie wing of the party up in arms. They won't show up. They won't support the Democratic nominee. And that kind of chaos would play into Trump's reelection chances perfectly. So I think that the brokered convention tactic is risky, but some of the candidates are definitely going for it still.
No, and even if it's not that much of a blowout, I think they still risk losing a lot of the Sanders supporters the same way that they did in 2016 when a lot of them actually, I think it was like 19% or something, didn't come out to vote for Clinton or ended up voting for President Trump. So I think that's still even a very big risk, even if it is a closed convention and they still don't give it to Sanders. But I guess we should have more answers come Saturday and definitely by Tuesday. But Brad Polumbo, it's always a pleasure.